Hello and welcome to the Occult Book Review. This week's book is Lost Knowledge of the Imagination by Gary Lachman, and it's published by Floris books. What is this book about? This book is about how science has relegated the imagination to a secondary role, and in that we have this lost depository of knowledge that we need to regain in order to move forward as more whole human beings, I suppose, in a healthier way. Lachman talks about the idea of science in the 17th century and how that seems to be the instigator for this, but it's not strictly true, as he says then. He talks about the axial age, which was this golden age where we had thinkers like Pythagoras, Confucius, Hebrew prophets, the Upanishads, Zoroastrianism, all appearing around the same time. But with this, we also had this movement from the mythical to the mental, and that seems to be kind of what began, I suppose, moving away from what Lachman terms this kind of Goldilocks moment where we had this balance or equilibrium even between the left brain and the right brain to something else entirely. He talks about an Irish monk called John Scotius Eriguana, and you might, if you're Irish, you know that he was on the old Irish £5 notes, and he infamously was, well, supposedly stabbed to death by his students with pens. But he wrote a book called The Celestial Hierarchy, and it was a way of breaking down the Godhead, I suppose, and into different emanations, from cherubs to angels to demons and to the Godhead itself. I often feel that there's some comparison between Eriguana and Desjardins, the idea of universal restoration and the kind of culmination of an omega point. I don't know if I'm on solid ground with that, but kind of on the seems to kind of reconcile itself. Anyway, later scholars then began to use this to divide things up, to move from quality to quantity. This is where technology began to come in as well. We began to get the measure of things, and number began to become much more important. And as Walter Percy says, and Lachman quotes, we became lost in the cosmos. So this book is very condensed, and it kind of summarizes an awful lot of Lachman's previous work. So he's talking about so many different philosophers and so many ideas that it's because he's such a good writer that it works. He provides his own visual representation sometimes of ideas, which is why I really like him as a writer. There was one line where he said Copernicus had set the sun loose from the earth. I thought that was a really nice line. But anyway, so as we progress through the book, we come to the ideas of existentialism then, and the kind of the so what pointlessness, as Lachman says, the scientism fallacy, believing that science can and must be the measure of all things. Lachman then goes on to talk about Alfred North Whitehead and the ideas of immediacy perception and meaning perception. And this ties into someone that Lachman talks about a lot, Ian McGilchrist, and his idea of the left brain and the right brain, the master and the emissary. Lachman goes on to talk about Owen Barfield quite a lot, who was someone that I didn't really know very much about. Talks about how Barfield's ideas, Barfield asked us to have a different type of participation, less separation. And then for occultists, people would know Schwaller de Lubitz, who asked us to have a think about intelligence of the heart. And this was the way ancient Egyptians were able to participate in unseen forces, with unseen forces, I should say. And he talks then about Goethe and the primal plant idea. He talks about the idea of phenomenology, and it's funny the way that keeps coming up. As I mentioned before, Dr. Jeremy Nadler talks about the need to go back to phenomenology, and I spoke about Desjardins earlier on, and I had just been dipping into his book, The Phenomenon of Man, and I came across a couple of lines which I think are interesting in the context of this book. Desjardins says, On the one hand, the materialists insist on talking about objects as though they only consisted of external actions in transient relationships. On the other hand, the upholders of a spiritual interpretation are obstinately determined not to go outside a kind of solitary introspection in which things are only looked upon as being shut in upon themselves in their immanent workings. And then he goes on to say, both fight on different planes and do not meet. Each only sees half the problem. And then he says, I am convinced that the 2 points of view require to be brought into union, and that they soon will unite in a kind of phenomenology of generalized physic in which the internal aspect of things as well as the external aspect of the world will be taken into account. So I thought that was a nice sync. The Goethe idea of the primal plant is very interesting when you think of it in a shamanic context, which it really is. Lachman talks about the parallels between the Heisenberg's observer effect and how observance is involvement. We know this now through quantum physics anyway. But it's shamanic because it's also it's something that's called doubling in contemporary terms, I suppose. I was reading about this in Sinister Forces Part 3, where Peter Levenda talks about how people who are CIA agents, I suppose, are using a kind of Stanislavski method to get to a point where they have to believe the character they become. So it's shamanic in a more destructive way, I suppose. He then goes on to talk about the idea of the objective psyche and Jung, and how Jung was taken aback when Philemon, his spiritual guide, told him that the thoughts in Jung's head had an objective reality and they didn't actually originate with Jung himself. So a lot of these states are achievable. Sometimes they come about naturally through crises, and I spoke about Whitley Strieber in the book The Supernatural a few weeks ago, and how I felt that he may have been taken not more seriously. He would be considered very differently if he had been born a couple of thousand years ago, as opposed to today, because a lot of thinkers who are able to get into these hypnagogic states and have these realizations are considered mad in contemporary society. That reminded me of some esoteric wisdom of the Dogon, who say that the non-material universe can see but can't act, whereas the material universe can act but can't see everything. So there's that kind of division again between the left brain and the right brain, between the material and the spiritual. I'm probably mixing up an awful lot of topics all at once here, but I guess that's what happens when you're a reader, because you make those associations yourself, and they're not always conveyable to people who haven't had the same reading experiences as you have. But later on, Lachman goes on to write how Corbyn was afraid that if we did marginalise imagination, it would be replaced by what he says is some kind of grotesque fascination with the absurd. And he describes this through the work of Eric Kahler, who kind of warned against this happening in art. And Lachman goes on to talk about kind of Andy Warhol art, and how people will walk into an art gallery and look at a cardboard box and go, wow, it's amazing, because we've become confused almost. There's a kind of emperor's new clothes syndrome here. Anything goes. The imagination has been replaced and sacrificed for this kind of self-preservation. No one wants to be the one who is kind of left out almost. And he says it's a conscious destruction of consciousness. And there's a quote from Joseph Heller and Catch-22 where he says, that might be the answer. To act boastfully about something we ought to be ashamed of. That's a trick that never seems to fail. So that kind of fits in, I think. Lachman then goes on to talk about Kathleen Raine and her almost mystical recognition of this kind of predicament, where she kind of predicted the idea of reality TV, and how what would happen would be the viewer would become the viewed. So how can we restore this way of thinking again, this imaginal, this Goldilocks moment. Lachman talks about certain occult thinkers and how they seem to have it right, this lost knowledge. I've also been told that I shouldn't really talk about what authors conclude at the end of the books, because I'm spoiling the books for people. So, well, it's kind of hard to sum up a review without doing that. But I was reminded, Lachman's last chapter reminded me of something that Dr. Jeff Kripal had written at the end of The Supernatural. So I'll just read that out. And he says, in order to try and see and bring into balance these the spiritual and the physical, we can make a cut, as he says, make a distinction between what has appeared and what is, and recognize that, as an embodied ego, you have no reliable access to the latter, and for one simple reason. You, yourself, are a biological medium or neurological filter. Do not believe what you believe. And it's very similar to what Lachman is arguing for. And then another line that Kripal writes, recognize that this splitting into a subject in here, perceiving objects out there, is a function of the human organism and its cognitive and sensory hardware, and probably not of the psychophysical world itself. So perhaps there's an answer there somewhere. So Lost Knowledge of the Imagination by Gary Lachman is a book I highly recommend. I kind of got the feeling that this is the end of a cycle for Lachman. I could be wrong about that, but I feel that he's summing up an awful lot of what he had previously written in this book. So I would also recommend his previous books as well, obviously. It's published by Floris Books, and that's it for this week, and I'll see you again very soon. Thanks.